I'm 24 years old and female. This is a bit hard for me to share, but I think it's important to address. So, my parents split up when I was young. Neither my dad nor my mom had their act together, which in turn caused me not to have my act together. From a young age, I was drinking and experimenting with recreational drugs. I was just falling into a cycle that my family had always been in. My mother had a tendency to sleep around with anybody that could give her the time of day, and this meant inviting some really creepy guys into our home. I think it's important to mention that she was a drug addict and didn't consider the danger. I had been arrested a few times before the age of 15 for either fighting or underage drinking. I was a mess. One night my mom and her occasional boyfriend were waiting up when I had stumbled and drunk. This was the moment I realized that I needed a change. My mom's boyfriend had pushed me down and then pulled me into another room of the house. My mom started banging on the door, begging him to let me go. To this day, I still won't forget that sinister look in his face. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It was the face of somebody who had bad intentions. It was a little smile, and I swear that it's burnt into my brain. He said something along the lines of, "I'm about to show you why it's bad to let your mom worry about you." I screamed, but he kept coming at me, but I put up a fight. After a couple of minutes of struggling, I scratched him in the face, but then he became enraged. Thankfully, my mom had phoned the police and he was arrested before anything serious could happen. There was a cop that was always present when I got in trouble, and he was around 60 at the time. I remember he was always giving me crap for my behavior. That night he was there. My mom was taken into custody along with her boyfriend, so I was sitting and waiting with him while they were getting my story, and then he said something that I'll never forget. "I'm really sorry about all of this. I'm sorry, but you're not going home." And then he told me, "It's time for you to change. Do you want to end up like her, or do you want to be somebody?" I told him that I wanted to be somebody. I wanted to break that cycle. I was put into foster care, which was a horrible experience at first, but it ended up being what I needed. He and I stayed friends until he passed away about a year ago. I always went to him when I needed guidance. I'm happy to say that I've been a corrections officer for the past 2 years because of him, and I'm pleased to honor his memory by pursuing a career in law enforcement. Also, losing me was what my mom needed to get her act together. She's been sober for almost 10 years and is remarried to a wonderful guy. Hopefully this is somewhat encouraging. In October of 2018, I was age 18 and my first year at university in a big city in the UK. I had always lived in the countryside before this, so I was never very street smart. About a year before I went to university, I had started a relationship with this guy, Jimmy, my now ex. It was my first real relationship and I thought the world of him, but it was not reciprocated in a loving and compassionate way. Jimmy started off as very emotionally abusive and got progressively worse, but that's a whole other story. At this point, Jimmy and I had been together for just under a year and had applied to universities in the same city mostly by coincidence, and both moved to the same city. I wanted to have a proper student life, so I got accommodation in a student block on the other side of the city to him. And Jimmy had been using for quite a while now, initially starting off with just smoking weed. But this progressed rapidly, and by the time we were at university, he was regularly doing a lot of harder drugs, plus smoking multiple times a day. Honestly, I don't think he was ever not high. When we moved to university, we still saw each other every couple of days, and he found a regular dealer, Mark, that he had been using continually since we got there in September. Jimmy used to buy for Mark multiple times a week, so on a handful of occasions I had briefly met him. Mark lived a lot closer to my student accommodation than to Jimmy's. So a couple of weeks before this all happened, Jimmy had started picking up drugs from Mark when he came to see me, meaning that Mark would often be outside of my accommodation. Jimmy had asked me a few times if I would pick up the drugs that he bought from Mark, but I always had felt weird speaking to Mark on my own. Plus, I rarely smoked, so I felt weird picking up drugs in general. 6 p.m. One day at the end of October, Jimmy had plans to come and see me that evening, and asked me again if I would pick up some stuff from Mark. I was in a good mood that day and feeling more confident than usual, so for the first time I agreed to it. Jimmy gave me Mark's number and said that Mark would message me when he was on his way. Only around 10 minutes later, I got a message from Mark saying that he was almost outside my apartment, and I needed to go outside, and so I did. Outside of my accommodation, there was a quiet area with a lot of benches, so I sat and waited for him. Behind me was only a wall and a small contained area that had all the bins for the building. Out of nowhere, I felt somebody's hands on my shoulder in a really weird and creepy way. I jumped, obviously, and realized that it was Mark, who I barely recognized him, as I had only briefly seen him a couple of times. I realized now that my back had been to the wall and the bin storage, so he must have been waiting there. I was immediately on guard because of how he touched my shoulders, especially because I didn't know him, so I shifted away from him as he sat down next to me. He began talking to me as if we were buddies, asking me 1,000,001 questions about myself, like deeply personal questions. The whole time I was deflecting, not wanting to give out any information, so I started asking him questions instead. He began a really deep monologue about himself and his life, where he openly told me that he had just gotten out of prison a few months before. It was for armed something, some kind of crime. I engaged his ramblings, just nodding along, but still trying to get back to the whole point of just picking up drugs from my boyfriend. 7 p.m. I have always been able to talk to anyone, and was always taught to be nice when somebody's talking. So I ended up sitting there for around an hour trying to get the conversation back to the reason that I was there. Pick up drugs from my boyfriend and go. It was so long that I actually started getting dark, but this guy just kept on talking. I knew that my boyfriend was going to be coming over soon, so I kept looking at my phone to see if he was on his way, but he hadn't replied. Eventually, I told Mark that I needed to get back inside and I was meeting up with my boyfriend soon, and then going clubbing after with some friends, so I needed to get ready, and if I could just please pick up the drugs. He then said, "Oh, well, I can't give them to you here. There's CCTV everywhere. We can go inside so that I can give them to you." I had witnessed him giving my boyfriend drugs in the same spot countless times before, so I knew this was BS. I didn't want Mark to come back to my apartment, so I told him that he could go into the lobby of my building where there was a disabled bathroom, and he could give them to me there. He agreed and followed me inside. We went into the bathroom. It was a very large room, so I didn't have to be too close to him, and he locked the door behind us. He then began fiddling with something in his pocket, I assumed the drugs, but instead pulled down his trousers fully and started peeing in the toilet. I was hugely freaked out. This guy just presented his member to me and began peeing, but I rationalized that there was no way he had any motive because he had met me and my boyfriend together, so he knew that I was in a relationship. Figured he just had to really go to the bathroom. I had kept my eyes shut the whole time, and when he flushed, I thought that he would give me the drugs that I was there to collect. This whole thing had been going on for about an hour and a half at this point. He said, "I really want to roll myself a joint, but there's no space in here to do it. Can I come and roll it on your desk and then I'll give you Jimmy's stuff?" I asked again if he could just give it to me now, and he said no, saying that I was being rude for not inviting him in. By this point, I was wanting to get ready to go out with my friends later that evening, and knew that my boyfriend would be coming by any minute, so I figured it would be okay even though I didn't want this. It's worth noting that I was emotionally abused by my boyfriend, and knew that he would be mad at me if I didn't collect his drugs, or if I annoyed Mark because he was his favorite dealer. I honestly figured that Mark was harmless, despite him telling me that he was a violent criminal earlier, and just assured myself that he was only a bit creepy and that it would be fine. 8 p.m. Reluctantly, I took Mark up to my apartment, opened the door, and let him in. I said that he had to roll his joint fast because I had to get ready. Finally, he gave me the drugs that my boyfriend wanted, so I felt better at that point. He walked over to my desk, moved all my things to the side, and sat down, getting out the things to roll his joint. I can't do it, but I've seen Jimmy do it countless times, so I know that it doesn't take more than a minute or so. Mark keeps trying to talk to me, but at this point, my answers are getting shorter and shorter. He rolls the joint so slowly that I can't even describe it. He then said, "Well, I can't smoke this outside, so is it cool if I stay here and smoke it? Only take 5 minutes." I said no and told him again that I had to get ready. He replied, "That's okay, you can get ready with me here." By this point, I was over it. I messaged my boyfriend again to tell him to hurry up. Mark asked me again, and in my frustration and wanting this guy out of my apartment, I just said, "Yeah, sure, just be quick." I then went out to my room into the shared kitchen. I only had 2 flatmates and nobody else was in the apartment that night. Grabbed some wine in a glass so that I could have some solitary pre-drinks and returned to my room. I sat for another 15 minutes being increasingly less polite, but he kept talking to me. I drank my first glass of wine pretty fast, and just decided if Mark was going to take ages then, I would get ready to go out with my friends. I told him that as soon as he had finished smoking, he could just leave on his own, so I left him sat at my desk, took some clothes into the bathroom and jumped into the shower. 9 p.m. Maybe a minute or so into my shower, I heard soft footsteps outside the door, and like a scene from a freaking horror movie, I saw the door handle slowly be turned down. Thank God I remembered to lock the door. All of a sudden, Mark began banging on the door. I turned the shower off and just said, hi, through the door. He shouted through the door asking me to let him in because he had to pee again. I obviously said no and just got dried and dressed. Thankfully, I took clothes to the bathroom as quickly as I could. By this point, I figured there was no way that he was going to leave my apartment until I did. So I did my makeup as fast as I physically could and messaged my friends that I would be coming to theirs sooner than I had planned. I still hadn't gotten a reply from my boyfriend, so I just told him that I was going out early and to not come over. I got ready to go and told Mark that I was leaving now, and that he needed to come downstairs with me. He was still sat at my desk and ignored what I was saying. He asked if I could stay in my room while I was out because he was tired and wanted to take a nap. Finally, I was firm with him, and after a lot of convincing, he left with me. I made sure to order an Uber to my friend's place so that he couldn't try and walk with me, and by the time that we got outside, my Uber was nearly there. He stood with me, looking over my shoulder at my phone the entire time. And then the Uber arrived, I got into it, and Mark straight up walked around the other side and got in. I was in disbelief and laughed, then told the Uber driver that I didn't know who this guy was, and that he wasn't getting in with me. And the Uber driver was not as polite as me and told Mark to get out, and he did. 10 p.m. I sat there on the way to my friend's house and finally felt calm that I had gotten away from Mark. I called my friend from the Uber and told her what happened, so she said she could come outside of her building to get me with a group of her flatmates. My friend's accommodation was not far from mine, and took longer to get to by car than on foot because of the one-way system in the city, but I didn't care at this point. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, I arrived, and my friend came over to the Uber and then brought me back to her group of friends. She had quite a few people with her, And suddenly I noticed that one of her male flatmates was talking to someone slightly away from the group. I looked over and suddenly realized that he was talking to Mark. I'm guessing that he was looking at the address when I had the Uber app open earlier. I whispered to my friend and she freaked out and went inside with me straight away. I was super freaked out that this guy wouldn't just leave me alone. He had refused to leave my side for the last few hours and now he had followed me to my friend's house. Honestly, I felt much safer now and met a few creeps in my time, so just decided to get over it by having a nice time with my friends. So we sat in her kitchen having a chat and some drinks. 11 p.m. After a while talking to her, I almost forgot what had happened just an hour ago and was getting increasingly tipsy from the wine. The kitchen door opened and her male flatmate comes inside, announcing that he invited a guy in who had just given him free weed. You guessed it, Mark walked in. Mark addressed me by name and walked over, putting his hands around my waist from behind. I get pretty confident when I drink, so I had no problem pushing him off me and announcing to everyone in a jokey way, "Yeah, this is the guy who's been following me around all evening. I don't know him." Even in this room with all my friends' flatmates, I still didn't feel safe. He stayed away from me, looking at me for a while from the other side of the kitchen. I just ignored him. My friend could tell that I was uncomfortable, so suggested that we go and drink in a room. Around 30 minutes after going into a room, the door slams open suddenly and Mark is standing there. He says, "Oh, I was looking for the bathroom. Can I use yours?" My friend had an in-suite. She tells him to get lost and he does. I'm honestly just bored of this guy's constant presence at this point, so we decide to go to the club early. 12 p.m. We grab our stuff, run past the kitchen door and outside. My friend orders an Uber and we get in and go to the club. After a while, some of her flatmates join us, but Mark does not, thank God. The people who had been in the kitchen said that Mark left shortly after he saw me and my friend leave, but there was no sign of him now. I just try and enjoy the night, but being a poor student, I can't afford any more drinks at the club. As I begin to sober up, I realize how shaken up and creeped out I am by the whole evening, and I don't feel safe. 2 a.m. After a couple of hours, I decide that I just want to go home and sleep because the whole experience has freaked me out. I take an Uber back and use my key card to get into my apartment building and go upstairs and into my apartment. I started getting ready for bed and put on some PJs and started taking off my makeup. And all of a sudden I hear a loud knock on my door. I had no clue who it was, but since it was still early-ish for a Friday night, I thought that my boyfriend had maybe finally decided to show up. My door didn't have a peephole, so I walked to the door in my PJs, unlocked it, planning to open it a tiny bit to see who it was, and then bam! The door flew open so fast that I was pushed backwards into my apartment and then shoved into my room, which was directly across from the front door. In my panic, I froze and then looked up only to realize that Mark was now standing in my apartment. The realization started to sink in. Mark had just forced his way into my room, and I was trapped in here with him. He was visibly angry and very high. He locked the door behind him and began rambling about how I was so rude for not inviting him in with my friends, for ignoring him and for not letting him in the Uber. I was terrified, so I ran over to my bed and grabbed my phone. He walked over behind me and began grabbing me, touching me as much as he could, so I shouted at him to get off. He saw my phone in my hand and immediately smiled, and he told me to open the camera. I was terrified, so I did as he said, and he said that he wanted a picture of us together. I did as I was told and took a selfie with him, while he posed with his arms around me and then kissing my cheek and my neck. He then screamed at me to unlock my phone, and so he did. He made me open up my messages and send Jimmy the selfie of me and Mark sat next to each other on my bed, and so I did. He waited for it to send and then grabbed my phone and put it down on the desk. He sat at my desk for the next 4 or 5 hours talking at me continually, saying how I was so rude. I needed someone to teach me some manners. How I had to do what he said because he was older than me. How Jimmy wasn't so good for me. How I was so beautiful and how he knew that I needed to be with him. He had told me that his girlfriend knew that he had been at my house that evening, and now she's sad that he can't go home, and it was all my fault. The whole time I continued bargaining with him, trying to get him to leave, but it didn't work. Occasionally, I would just lie down on my bed or sit and not speak. Each time I did, he would get up and wrap his arms around me or try and spoon me, stroking my face and trying to kiss me, and trying to take my clothes off and touch me. Every time that I fought him off, he would just get angry again and go and sit at the desk and keep shouting. I knew that this guy had previously been in prison for some kind of violent crime, so I didn't want to upset him. I just sat there for hours and quietly sobbed, too scared of trying to leave because I would have had to walk past him to get to the door. I was out of options and I didn't know if I could get out without making him angry. I couldn't call the police because he had my phone. My flatmates weren't in, so my screams meant nothing. 6 a.m. While he was sat at my desk, he kept smoking more weed or taking a line of whatever drug he did. He was becoming more sleepy as he smoked more weed until I was able to speak between his ramblings, so I gently said that I was going to the bathroom. I noticed that his eyes had partially closed and figured that I only had one chance, so I took the opportunity and grabbed my phone off the desk as quickly as I could, unlocked the door and ran out of the apartment. The one thing that I'll always remember is being in tears, pressing the button for the elevator to come probably about 50 times, because I was so scared that he would come after me. As I got into the elevator, I heard him come out of my apartment shouting my name, but the elevator doors closed as he looked at me. I was able to get downstairs and out of the building. I ran around the corner of the building in my PJs and manically dialed the number for the police. I told them what happened and that this guy had been in prison until recently, and the next thing I knew, around 5 police cars showed up. I was in such a state and I called my boyfriend to tell him what happened. He was still awake and hadn't come to visit the night before because he was with a girl who was his friend, and said that now he didn't want to come to be with me because he had some weed on him and didn't want to be near the police. I told him to get to my place right now and he reluctantly did. The police had to force entry to my apartment because Mark had locked himself in it and barricaded the door. They arrested him and he ended up going to prison for drug charges, but not what he did or tried to do to me. The police said they couldn't prosecute him because I had willingly let him into my apartment earlier in the night, and he hadn't physically done anything. After I had given my statements to the police, I went back inside so to see that after I had escaped, my room had been trashed. Mark had thrown things around and smashed things in anger. I'm so glad that I got out when I did because I can't imagine what would have happened if I was trapped in a crossfire. I don't know what happened to Mark after that, but I moved out of that apartment a couple of months later and away from that city as soon as everything happened with the pandemic, to make sure that Mark could never find me. I actually stayed in that relationship for another year or so until I realized that I was too good to put up with what Jimmy did. I had such severe PTSD from the incident that I couldn't go outside for months after, which messed up the whole of my first year at university. It has taken until now for me to be able to walk around at night, and being alone in public is very difficult. I'm well aware that the ending is very anticlimactic and I wish that I had been able to advocate for myself, but I just shut down emotionally afterwards. I can't get too much into the details of what happened because honestly, thinking about it makes me want to throw up. But I realized that I was so lucky to be able to fight him off every time, because without a doubt he wanted to hurt me. After this all happened, I started volunteering with people in prison for crimes like this, to try and prevent them from ever reoffending. I think it's my way of advocating for others because I couldn't advocate for myself. If you take one thing away from this, stop being so polite. I was raised to be nice to everyone, and I realize now that being polite worsened everything. I wish that I had never been polite enough to pick up drugs from my ex, or polite enough to let Mark into my apartment when he begged. So to Mark, screw you and please, let's never meet again.